Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and in this episode, I'm going to talk about what men think. I've read a lot in magazines like Cosmo and so forth, which discuss relationship issues, and they obviously discuss them from a point of view that tries to enlighten women as to what to do with men. Sometimes what I find left out in articles that are written that way is it kind of leaves out the man's point of view. And I know they have a column in there where they talk about sexuality and so on and so forth, but there isn't oftentimes a whole lot of time to get into some of the depth. And there can be a wide range of issues in which men obviously have a thought about, but we don't necessarily have the deep conversations going on about these things. And oftentimes we sort of dumb the conversation down, especially when it comes to women, not about women, but when we dumb the conversation down about men when we're talking to women, because it assumes a lot of things about men, about them being unsophisticated and thoughtless and not caring and so on and so forth. And I think it's a misperception about what men are after. We get into deep conversations about sex and how there's the male drive to have that happen. And then we have women who are offended about that because they feel like they're being treated like sex objects. And while I understand the objectification of the act itself, when you think about the anthropology and how things come to being, there lies better explanations for some of these things. And sometimes talking about the root causes of these things really enlightens us as to why we behave the way we do. And, you know, we can talk about all kinds of things, such as how we were raised and like I say, the evolution of things. And it makes for very interesting discussions. But short of all of that, I mean, we're not here to go through an anthropology lesson and even possibly theology, but I'm going to talk about it where we have discussed things, but sometimes we have left out some of the important, just the simple pieces to understanding what's really beneath it. And I know sometimes we dumb it down. We talk about it in the lowest common denominator as if that's going to really enlighten us, and it doesn't. I think it adds to the confusion. And I think as we elevate the conversation, as we talk about people and men and women in the relationships in general on some of the more specific things, as though we are really enlightened people, that we really are looking to have a relationship that we value and that we want to build trust and talk to people from this position, then I think the knowledge becomes better and we ask better questions. And one of the things that I started out with, I talked about sex and men's perception about sex. I think it's really easy to say it's just about a man trying to get off, trying to have an orgasm, or even women for that matter. And I think my audience, this is sort of directed to women to help them to learn to ask better questions, but also for any male listeners that are out there to think better of themselves and to realize that you are a lot more sophisticated than oftentimes you give yourself credit for. So as we think about it in those terms, there is more to discover, and maybe men themselves begin to ask better questions so that they can have better explanations to some of the things that may get asked of them by their partners or by their children. because when it comes to understanding us, there are things that are very complex. I mean, there are things that the human body does that are amazing, and our understanding of it pales in comparison. I mean, that's why there's medicine and why they're constantly making advances. And I don't mean in just pills, but I mean in terms of the discovery of the ability of the body to repair itself, the ability of the human mind to overcome obstacles. But anyway, back to the comment that I started to, or the subject I started to talk about in regards of sex. When we talk about it, I mean, oftentimes it comes up because we think of it from the romantic connection, or maybe not the romantic connection, but from that aspect of pleasure. And I think we understand procreation. You know, you have sex, babies are born, and the population goes on. That's the anthropology part of it. But when we think about how it operates in the relationships that we're in, and to perceive that men are purely sexually motivated is such a departure from where the conversation should be. And understanding that for men, sex is a part of a relationship. It's how men perceive closeness and intimacy and acceptance. Because when you think about these things, intimacy, closeness, when women think of intimacy and closeness, women have no problem with touching and showing affection in a way, and we see that as feminine. Men don't necessarily see emotion and affection and touching in the same way. And because of that, when men experience that closeness, that sometimes that feeling of intimacy leads to wanting a deeper connection. And oftentimes that's the sexual act. But think about the touching aspect. Think about the skin-to-skin contact and the arousal part of that happens for men. And when you become really physically close to someone and get embraced, and if you think about the sexual act in the case of men and women, and I'm thinking simply in say in a missionary position, where there's the back rubbing, there's the rubbing of the neck, there's the touching, and you know, in a lot of cases this is really good for foreplay. Then you begin to understand what some of the drive is about and why it's such an important thing for a man in the relationship. And I totally get that women obviously want that kind of bonding, that kind of connection in a relationship. And men want it too. Don't think that they're always just out to get a quick lay. Men talk about things in those terms because it seems okay to just talk about it in those terms. But I think if you were to elevate the conversation, if you were to take one guy in that group and begin to raise that conversation, the consciousness of these kinds of things, I think men would agree with what I've just been sharing. And what I hope is to raise the conversation to a different level so that we're not always thinking about it in terms of the short-term gain, but think about it in the long-term gain. And when I talk about sex, I'm not really talking about it in terms of the morality. I'm talking about it in terms of the emotion. And one could argue that that's a part of it, but I just want to leave that out of it for a second, but want to talk about the physicality, the closeness, the touching, and what happens when, you know, you're stroking someone's back or stroking their forehead, or when you're in, you know, such proximity to someone else's personal space that you really get a sense of this is intimacy. I mean, when you can imagine being in someone's space that close, you see all of their flaws. You see, you know, we're talking, you know, physical flaws, whether it's wrinkles, whether it's the blemished skin, whether it's the rough skin, or whatever it is. And it's wanting to be accepted for all of those imperfections, or what we see as imperfections. And sexuality and intimacy provides that, which we then begin to accept ourselves. Because when it's really ironic that when you get the sense that someone else will accept you, it's funny how we're sort of cross-wired at times. When someone else will accept you, then you begin to accept yourself. When we kind of like to think of it that we could operate the other way as human beings, but we're sort of like pack animals, and we love to work in groups, and it's actually part of a survival instinct, because if you try to do each and everything on your own, your back is exposed. Just think of that metaphor. But going back to the thought of intimacy and being in someone's personal space and being accepted and how soothing it is, there's this warm flush that comes over you. And now that's obviously this sort of chemical thing that's going on inside the body, and we can use that for another discussion. But when that happens, we tend to see the world differently when we feel accepted. And I would like to say that starts with a partner. Now, going back to women and perceiving men and how this works for them, when a man has that connection with you, then constantly he's going to seek your approval. And that is kind of the bond. That's what happens. You seek approval, and I think it's appropriate, because the interdependence that you have on that person, that you begin to develop, because you're developing a certain level of trust, which comes with intimacy, which comes with time, the trust and the dependence, and it grows. And over time, these are the kinds of things that help you to better yourself. It even changes your perception of the world, because as you become enlightened about yourself, you then begin to learn how to see possibility in others. And hopefully that leads to better understanding and compassion. So when relationships tend to fall apart, when we can look at how they are put together, then we can look for the missing pieces and begin to reconnect, begin to find those missing links. Because one of the questions, when couples are having a difficulty, one of the questions that I would ask is, what did you like about that person when you first met them? Now, I realize that when we first meet somebody, we don't know a lot about them. We kind of are in that honeymoon phase, and that's all kind of self-generated, okay? Those warm, flush feelings. But, we ask a lot of things about the person because we want to find out what the connection is, what we have in common. And then the relationship grows. And ultimately, over time, these things transition. You have other things that happen, and you might find out some of the quote unquote, let me use the word, shortcomings that your new love, your newfound partner may have, and these positives and negatives tend to balance out, and you work on those things. But then when the relationship starts to tail off and starts to kind of get in negative land, begin to ask, what is it about that person that you liked when you met them? And what sustained that? And when we get into that part of the conversation, we begin to look at, okay, well, these are the pieces that are missing. Well, how did that begin to happen? I mean, was it because they started spending time elsewhere? Was it because of the job? Or was it, where did you have kids? What other commitments? Or was it just some arbitrary thing? And we look to reconnect with that. If that's what it is that needs to be fixed, maybe you might need to introduce something else, because maybe something just got stale and boring. But it's in understanding it from that perspective. And when we know this about ourselves, sometimes we can self-correct. We can repair our own relationships. We don't necessarily need to go to a counselor to do it, but it does take self-awareness. And again, me talking about this is about raising the conversation so that we can have resolve. And one of the things that I like to do is, when discussing about relationships, it's understanding that relationships work great when there's no conflict. But what you want to know about somebody else is, how do they handle conflict? Because it's going to happen in every relationship. There's always conflict, because we're human beings. There's always conflict. So decide how you're going to resolve conflict. Think of some strategies, whether it's code words, whether it's, we're going to write these things out and then try to address them in a way that's comfortable for both of us, that, we have our own little committee, and I mean just the two, without introducing other parties. Like, don't ask friends, don't ask family. They don't necessarily need to give you advice in this, because oftentimes they can be very biased. And if they're not skilled at problem solving, they generally just stir the pot and create more problems for you. And we would certainly want to avoid that, because we're trying to make it work for togetherness. And unless it's bigger things, unless we're talking about, drugs and somebody maybe being abusive in the relationship, which totally takes this outside of what I'm trying to talk about in terms of fixing our own relationship, then you generally can at least have some idea about what you want to work on. And if you need to call in a referee, such as a pastor or a therapist or somebody like that, they're going to ask you these questions, and it's good to have answers to them. And hopefully both of you come in with the resolve to want to work on the relationship and not try to sabotage it. But back to my point of understanding the intimacy and the sophistication with which men actually operate, but sometimes through the fault of their own, they don't ask the right questions of themselves to be able to seem as interesting and as intellectual as they can be. And quite often women are much, much, much better at this thing because of the stakes that are involved. I mean, if we're talking about long-term relationships, and if we're talking about the possibility of kids, because of the stakes that are involved, women clearly have taken the lead in understanding these things. But men are not without feelings and thoughts and understanding. They have them. And sometimes it takes a lot just to dig it out of them to help them become aware. And I'm not making this a woman's responsibility, because clearly it's not. But what I'm asking of women, of the listeners of this, is to consider that, how sophisticated men are, and that they do love you, they do care about you. Sometimes men do it in a way that is, well, it's just not as good as it can be. But I tend to look for the silver lining. I like it when people try to make a sincere effort. I don't give anyone a free pass. And, especially guys, if they're going to be crass and going to act ignorant, then, you know what? Scratch them, kick them to the side, because there is a better man out there who's going to care, who's going to want to make an effort, who wants to be seen for who he is. So that being said, I'm going to take a break here, and I'm going to talk about a few other aspects. Hold on.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And in this particular episode, I am talking about what men think. I started off by sharing some ideas about the importance and the power of sex in a relationship for man, and that it's not just a one-dimensional kind of thing, but we talk about intimacy and touching and how that feels and how that's part of the bonding experience. And while you may not have heard it from men, it is very much a part of who they are. And sometimes what men lack is they lack the understanding of themselves to be able to define it in these terms. I think guys have done a lot of the things that guys do is they don't necessarily elevate the conversation. They sometimes think it, and it sounds good when it finally gets out there, but until somebody kind of shares it with them, they are oftentimes at a loss to talk about it. But it's not that they don't feel it. And what I also kind of shared is women oftentimes have the feelings, they're able to sum it up. And women being who they are, they're waiting for the guy to actually share their feelings, share the thought. And I don't give guys a free pass for not knowing the answers. I think it's all part of the overall consciousness to raise the level of conversation we're having and not just allow it to be dumbed down all the time. So that was about sexuality. And, I also emphasize the importance of relationships to men. We have conversations about men being commitment phobic. And I know that term is out there. And it can be applied to men and women. And what basically commitment phobic is, let me say the word clearly, it's just a person, has a fear of being in a commitment. And they tend to give a lot of sort of innocent excuses for not carrying a relationship forward, let's say, as opposed to making a commitment, let's say next week to go to the theater, maybe a month from now, making a commitment to take a trip together. And I might be able to explain a little bit of that. And this has to do with when you get to learn about somebody's history in life. I'm going to offer an explanation to something like this. And what it goes to is probably goes back to childhood, where if you're a person who has been constantly let down, meaning let's say you're a child and you've been told, hey, tomorrow we're going to go to the park, and, you've go to sleep tonight and you wake up, you go to school, and then afterwards you come home and you say, wow, we're going to go to the park and play. And then it doesn't happen. Okay, there's disappointment. Do something like this repeatedly to someone, and what you're going to find is people are not necessarily going to want to commit to anything because there is the fear of letdown. And when you do that, when you start young and you do that, people tend to repeat that pattern over and over again. So if you can imagine, fast forward this a few years and you're in the dating world and you have a partner who, may not have experienced it like that, but you're a guy that experienced that, and the girl is asking you to make a commitment about something and you just seem to really soft pedal it. Well, if you take into account what has happened to this person, that commitment seems like it never gets seated or never happens, then you can understand why a person won't make a commitment. It's important for the man to understand himself well enough so that he can work around that. Obviously, when you're an adult, you can face adult things, but sometimes there's not an awareness of that. And it's an amazing thing when you have that aha moment and realize, wow, yeah, that's what's happened to me. What I'm talking about is something that's totally different than a person that won't make a commitment because they've got a bunch of other relationships that they're trying to do. Okay. We talk about people having fallback relationships, so they don't want to commit to anything because they kind of want to stay loose so they can, pick and choose and so on and so forth. I think there's a little bit of that kind of thing happening even for those people in their lives. They've stacked the deck so high so that they always have a fallback because they're afraid of not having something that they feel they need, which is the love and the affection and the attention that fulfills them. So, when we think about these people being commitment phobic, there is that explanation of what commitment phobic is. But when we talk about the whys of commitment phobia, then we get down into the nuts and bolts. And this is what I mean by elevating the conversation. A lot of people understand the word and they understand the definition, but they don't understand the whys behind it. And if this sounds like you, then you can begin to say, reprogram yourself and learn what the differences are, what kind of things to involve yourself in. So such as if you've experienced people letting you down, then you know when that kind of thing happens, you learn to recognize it. And you say, okay, I'm not going to spend my time around people that are, I'm going to use the word flaky, because that tends to repeat the experience I've had over and over again. And I need to find myself around people who commit to things, who are able to see it through, who understand that, even if it's tough, we still can figure a way out of this and have a good result. I understand this intimately. I have experienced those kind of things. And being a guy, being labeled, if I were commitment-phobic, it's a painful thing to have somebody say that, because what, I would understand is that they don't have confidence in me. And if you can imagine what it's like being in a relationship with somebody or trying to be in a relationship with someone, and when they don't have confidence in you, then there's this part that you don't feel deserving, and you're always trying to please somebody. And I can share some of my other podcasts. I talk about the white knight syndrome, which is someone who always wants to come to the rescue of someone, and why they have that proclivity. It's way deep. But thinking about the subject of men and not wanting to make commitments, there's a lot of things that have been talked about on the subject that's out there. But this is something in terms of understanding that when you've been let down time and time again, this is why people oftentimes have a secret life, why they stack the deck so that they've always got a fallback. And some people never understand that about themselves. They don't understand that that's a fear of being disappointed, let down. And when they can work around that, when they can understand themselves to create the workaround so that they can be more directed, more self-assured, more self-reliant, then those problems tend to go away. I'm going to take a break here. Hold on.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Last but not least, I'm going to talk about, from a man's perspective, the importance of having the respect from his woman. And when I say his woman, I don't mean to be pejorative that women are owned. It's just, I'm talking about it in the sweetness of being a couple and wanting to be respected by a person that they feel a love for and intimacy for. The way I see men is I see them trying very hard to impress the woman that they're with. They want to be a protector. They want to be loving. They want to get it right. I don't know anyone that starts out by trying to just be a jerk. They want to get it right, and they seek approval. That's just innate. And when you are vulnerable to someone, the slightest amount of praise makes a difference, just as much as the slightest amount of displeasure can go a long way. And when we're in the world that we're in, it seems like there's a lot of negativity that goes on. And that's why being positive is such an important part of life. That when you can exude positivity, that charisma, that beauty, that makes you interesting. And when a man is in a relationship with a woman, he's obviously seeking approval. And it is not just for sex. It's because He wants to come to depend on this woman. And in the way we talk about monogamous relationships, and I realize that's important to a lot of people, and there's lots of different kinds of relationships. I can expand on that in another podcast. But in the interest of monogamy, and I know women talk about that being very important to them, then this should also be important, and that's in respecting your man. Men are very capable of doing things well, and they're also very capable of screwing up royally. And it's in the messing up part that they tend to get a lot of attention. And that's the fear that when they make the mistakes, that it'll be discovered. That's part of the reason why men will lie and being discovered, because then they tend to lose face. That can be described as a self-esteem issue, which when it surfaces, when it's uncovered, it should be addressed in an appropriate way. But I hope that women, as you're listening to this, that you're understanding a man better and understanding the vulnerability. And I know there's the macho thing that's on the outside. That's just an exterior. Quite often, and I know women have met men who seem really gruff on the outside, but they're teddy bears on the inside. So I would encourage women to share that part of a conversation and come up with interesting anecdotes that they could share, which would then raise the conversation, and then take that back to the men in your life. And if you have sons and daughters, have the conversation with them about these other aspects of people, and let's see where that gets us. I think it'll make for a better world. So I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Join me next time. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.